Welcome to today's meeting of the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices and use the hashtag #AssemblyFire for this meeting. On the agenda today is a discussion on London's resilience and emergency planning. Before we begin, we have a few small items of business. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assemblymember Cooper and also from Assemblymember Duval, for whom Assemblymember Desai is substituting. And in accordance with Standing Order 2.4, Assemblymember Moema will be attending virtually today.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Clerk. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? There are none. Okay, and can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 1st of February 2023? Thank you. And can we note completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Fantastic. We now move on to our main item, London's resilience and emergency planning. Can I welcome our guests for our first panel focusing on legislative and guidance changes? We have Baroness Twycross, the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, Jonathan Smith, Deputy Commissioner at London Fire Brigade, Toby Gould, Acting Head of London Resilience Group, Joe Gillespie, Deputy Director, Resilience and Emergency Division, Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and Colin Payne, Head of Strategy, Resilience and Recovery for Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. I'll start off with the questions, and we'll begin with legislation and guidance. And the first question is to you, Joe. The post-implementation review of the CCA recommended making resilience standards statutory, as well as the need to update the guidance. Is the government considering action? Is the government considering actioning these?
Thank you, and could I thank you for the invitation today? It is very much appreciated, and apologies, I have a slight cold, so, and also if I speak too quickly, please do shout at me as well. Obviously, the what we call the PIR was published on the 1st of April last year, and from that, it's a long-term process looking at the post-implementation. In terms of your question about standards, etc., my colleagues in Cabinet Office very much lead on the legislation, but we work very closely with them, so I have been in conversation with them. As part of the stronger LRF work, which we are looking at as we move forward, we will be looking at assurance and the use of standards as well. So at this moment in time, we are looking at what that means. The implementation review does have quite a long time frame, and we'll be looking through, and it's based around also the UK resilience framework as well. So again, it is not an immediate thing that's going to happen, but certainly the use of standards in the assurance process is critical. So again, it's a slightly holding response, but again, it's something that we want to look at as we move forward in the resilience world. How do we use the standards? How do we assure the work of LRS effectively as well? So I would say watch this space, because again, it's something we really want to develop, and develop with the LRFs as well, and colleagues in London LRF particularly, because again, we want to make sure that it works for the LRFs as well as working in terms of our role within central government as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. At this committee in October, the Deputy Mayor, Baroness Twycross, said that she thought that there might be significant costs associated with strengthening local resilience forums. Will the government ensure there's funding provided for these proposed changes?
Thank you. And you will have seen, hopefully, that the UK Government Resilience Framework that was published 19th of December last year, again, does recognise that there needs to be a consideration of the funding for LRFs, especially as we go through the strengthening process as well. And again, you will also note that we, for LRFs, we did provide pilot funding in 21-22. I think London received £145,000, and we now have a 3-year settlement as well, also with a similar amount of money. But we do recognise that the strengthening LRF work that is indicated in the framework will need consideration of that funding. And, you know, including, we want to sort of test the idea of chief resilience officers as well. So it is very much recognised that we have to think about how that is sort of funded. So again, we are sort of working with ministers as well to work through our policy proposals on that, particularly around our pilot programme.
Yeah, so the idea of a testing chief resilience officers, I think, is an interesting one. How would you envision that? Would you, in terms of a countrywide testing of that?
Obviously, every LRF is different, and I think London is actually some way along that path already, and working very closely with Barna, sort of Twycross has been a part of our sort of developing our thinking. The idea being it's something that to try and test that single leader, and I think the different models will be different in different LRF areas, and we are hoping to pilot this model as we go forward, and hopefully by the end of this year we'll have some pilot projects up and running with different LRF areas, and we're very, very keen to involve and to ensure London is part of that pilot process. I think for the Chief Resilience Officer, it is something about the leadership space. And again, I'm saying this generically. I'm not saying this about London at all, because I do think that we do see a superb leadership model from within the London LRF. And it's around ensuring that the Resilience Officer is able to... It's about strengthening resilience. It's not around sort of... It's developing on from risk-based planning into a much stronger resilience model involving the community and involving the entire cycle, the preparedness aspect, response, but also the recovery and consequence management aspects as well, and how we build community sort of resilience. And again, it's around broadening the bandwidth for resilience and really embedding it in sort of place-based policy as well. So it's around the idea of really, really strengthening what is resilience about. Thank you.
I think you're right, and I really appreciate your point on community strengthening and community-based resilience, which is something we've hit upon in this committee many, many times, particularly surrounding the LFB. Fiona, over to you. What further changes would you like to see from the guidance?
So you mean from the resilience framework? Yeah. So I think that I felt it was... so I think there's some really good things in the resilience framework. I am on record as saying, so I'll say it for the purpose of this committee as well, I felt it was a shame that the government moved away from a full strategy and replaced it with a sort of strategic direction and intent of direction. I don't think it's quite the same, but I'm really reassured to see that many of the comments that we put forward have been incorporated in the UK resilience framework. And it is really encouraging to see enhancements to such areas as risk ownership, so accountability and communicating risk with the public. It's no use people sitting and knowing that there's a risk without the public being aware, and that's particularly the case with things like flooding, which we've discussed quite a few times, particularly in the context of some of the climate change, and Assembly Member Polanski has raised it a number of times. The strengthening community resilience is particularly welcome, and I'm most excited about the investment in LRFs, particularly around skills. So, and I've had a number of conversations with some of Joe's colleagues around the Resilience Academy, which I think could really offer a huge amount to strengthen the capacity of individuals who are sort of working on LRFs. So, and that's particularly key because obviously you have the emergency services who we normally see as part of response, but later on today we'll hear from local authorities who, from my view, are as much part of the key responder model within LRFs as emergency services, but you get people coming through local authorities who don't get as much investment in the skills and knowledge around civil contingencies and what the role of a local authority is, and then ultimately what their role as senior local authority staff could and should be. So I think that's particularly welcome. Do you want me to talk a little bit about what I think could have been included as well, or
yes,
is that
absolutely.
enough at the moment? Yeah. So I think that I agreed with the three principles set out in the strategy. So understanding of risks, investing in preparation to better prevent, mitigate and recover from risks, and that sort of concept of whole society resilience, although a caveat to whole society resilience is you're more resilient if you have the ability to if you have sort of surplus cash, you're more able as an individual to be resilient. And actually going back to some of the conversations we had about the preparedness for Brexit, we did have discussions about the fact that the more resilient people were, the more likely they were to be able to just sort of have that little bit of a stockpile when people were starting to panic about supplies and food and things like that. So in terms of the further scope to enhance the strategy, I think clarifying responsibilities and ensuring proportionate funding for resilience activity before, during and after an emergency might be helpful. There's demographic challenges to resilience. I've mentioned sort of income and sort of relative income, but the concentration of risk in urban areas doesn't always get reflected in government funding. Urban areas, if there's a flood in an urban area, it's much more likely to cause risk to life and livelihood just because of the concentration and because of the concentration of vulnerable people and how crises can exacerbate inequalities. And we saw that a lot during COVID. I'm really keen that we create a learning culture where we learn from our own and others' experience. I think there is an LRF Chairs conference in a week or so's time, but I think that more of that sort of shared learning and sort of having that sort of expertise in a sort of community of practice across all the different sectors would be really valuable. It's maybe something that can develop with the Resilience Academy and that sort of idea that of shared knowledge. And I'm also particularly keen to build greater capacity. We've got this thing about we don't have an awful lot of latent capacity within public sector organisations, as we learned during COVID, although we did see that you could redeploy resources such as the fire service contributed to areas that they didn't normally cover because they had a little bit more capacity during COVID than some of the other agencies involved. So I think it's how do you invest in spare capacity? How do you make sure that you move away a little bit from this idea that you have just enough, just in time, to that just in case piece as well. So I could probably talk about this for hours, and I know you've got limited time, but I think overall, I think it's really, really, really timely that government is reflecting on where we go with resilience. Could they do more? Always, but I think it's a really good and promising start, and we're very keen to engage government on the way forward.
Great, thank you very much. And Toby, just over to you. Same question. What further scope do you think there is to enhance the strategy?
Well, good morning. Good morning, and thank you. I agree completely with Baroness Twycross. I've worked in resilience for a long time, and I'm quite pleased to see the themes and the principles that have borne out in the strategy. So, for me, it's more moving forward. How do we make sure, and how do we do London's engagement in not just how the framework is delivered and what that means for London, but also London's contribution to national policy development. So that's where we've started now, and obviously the framework's only been out for a couple of months now, and we've got a long way to go. But that's where I'm particularly keen, is to look at what it really means for London moving forward, where we can contribute, and as a partnership, particularly how we resource that and how we overlay that onto an already busy partnership. So particularly in the newer areas of ground for LRFs and for London's Resilience Forum, whether that's preparedness and adaptation or a greater assurance regime, whatever it might be, is just making sure that we are, we can work with government on that road ahead and set ourselves up to succeed with those sorts of initiatives without just overlaying them on already busy people.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to hand over now to Assembly Member Desai, who's going to ask questions about UK government resilience frameworks. More questions.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. I've got a couple of questions to representatives of the Department for Levelling Up. Perhaps if I could direct my questions initially to you, Ms. Gillespie, and then your colleague may have to come in if he's got anything to add. So the UK Government Resilience Framework is described as the first step on how the government will deliver a new strategic approach to resilience. What are the next steps, and what is the timescale for these steps?
Thank you, Councillor Desai. The overall framework is owned by my colleagues in Cabinet Office. So again, I can speak to the stronger LRF aspect, but you will see that the actual framework does have a long time scale, looking up to 2030 in that sense. So this is the long haul. This is not an immediate sort of delivery. So, but in terms of the priorities, in terms of my department and DLUC, it's very much looking at that, strengthening the LRFs. How do we, bring? I can only agree with everything that Baroness Twycross has said. How do we build this into how we strengthen the model of the LRF? And I think again, so looking at that, we hope to have our pilots looking at a number of areas. We hope to have that in place by the end of the year. And then we will be evaluating those pilots after sort of 2 years. I'm just double checking that's correct. And so again, but the wider framework does have that longer time scale, looking up to 2030. My colleagues from Cabinet Office would be able to give more detail about all the risk-based work or about the Resilience Academy, but we work very closely together. All of this goes together to support the work of the LRF. We're already seeing those changes coming through. How we look at risk is changing to a more continuous process rather than a fixed. There was a 2-year cycle, for example, the publication of the National Security Risk Assessment. That's now moving to a continuous process. We're looking at sort of the chronic risks. We're looking at the different types of risks. What are the impact of things like climate change, which will change how we look at risk? And I think the one thing I'd like to say from my department's perspective, actually being here today really shows the direction of what we want to sort of drive as well, the engagement of local democratic representatives in resilience. To me, this is a really welcome sort of event to be able to make, because you're the ones who will work with communities, the demographic questions, the deprivation questions, how people think of resilience, how people think of risk, that needs your support as well. So I see the framework as a starting point. I don't see it as an end point in itself either. I think this is going to be a continual process, because again, I'm on my high horse now. How we communicate risk, we are chronically bad at explaining risk. We are very bad, and I think it's something that I used to be a scientist, so again, this is my background. Really want to help people understand what risk means. What does a 1 in 100-year flood mean? Does that mean I'll never get flooded for 99 years? We are not good at explaining that. So I think the whole aspect of the framework about sort of, and our work in strengthening LRS is broadening that to make sure that we're able to engage the community better and understand our communities better as well. And, that urban versus rural, that's, the challenges we face ahead of us, of which, as the climate crisis being sort of the really big one coming up. And I think that's the whole purpose of the framework, is strengthening those underpinning sort of pillars to the work. That possibly hasn't answered your question as well as you'd like, but it's something that I'm actually quite passionate about. So.
I can see that coming through.
Thank you.
And I've got no problems with you being on your high horse. So. Do you have anything to add, Mr. Payne?
No, I think that kind of covers it. So the main framework is owned by Cabinet Office. Like I say, we've got a really clear plan for implementing the Stronger LRF's pilots, which we're hoping to launch towards the end of this year. And then there is wider action across government to think about next steps. So I think we've talked about an integrated review refresh, for example, which I think will also touch on some of these themes as well in the future. Thank you.
Just one more question, again to Ms. Gillespie. The framework sets out plans for a new head of resilience and a new directorate. Can you explain how your department will fit into this new structure? I mean, I must say, I don't really sit on this committee, so there's a lot I'm learning. I've learned this morning, but there seems to be a number of structures here.
We'll have to talk through the joys of Whitehall departments, which is a sort of an experience all to itself. So in terms of, as Colin has said, the overall sort of resilience framework, Cabinet Office are the lead for the legislation and the framework itself. In terms of local resilience, that's a joint responsibility between my department and Cabinet Office. The Chief Resilience, the resilience, Head of Resilience that you've mentioned, that is something that will be sort of, that's the Cabinet Office sort of a role. So again, the thinking is still being developed on that. Again, it's something that is coming through, but it's to try and my understanding is really to try and embed resilience, so better within Whitehall as well. So again, the thinking hasn't fully formed yet. So again, when there's more to share, very happy to share that with colleagues here.
Thank you, Chair. My question, which I had for the Deputy Mayor, has been answered.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much. Thank you, Assemblymember Desai. We're now going to hand over to Assemblymember Polanski, who's going to take us through some questions on the Manchester Arena inquiry.
Thank you, Chair. Just before I do, Joe, if I can return to your previous comments, first of all, thank you for your high horse. I think, as the Deputy Mayor essentially said, that so often the people who are least resilient to deal with resilience and climate impacts are often those the worst affected. So I appreciate particularly what you said about democratic engagement, and also the Deputy Mayor for highlighting that. That all being said, we just talked about flooding. My understanding is that the London Fire Brigade don't have a statutory duty over flooding yet. Over the last couple of years, we've seen hospitals under threat. We've seen people submerged in cars and trapped. Would it not make sense that London does have that statutory duty?
I'm afraid the fire sort of legislative responsibility falls under Home Office and not me, so I'd be reluctant to comment at this time. I am aware, though, that fire services, the job they do in flood response is remarkable. So I've personally, again speaking personally, I've not seen a sort of that preventing the fire services across the country from doing a superb job in flood response. Another part of my role is I lead for our department on flood recovery. There's a flood recovery framework, and that sits with my team. So it's something that we're very experienced with, the aftermath of flooding. But so I would probably wish to pass that comment to my fire service colleague rather than me answer.
I accept that it's not your department, but the scale of the climate crisis, we need the fire brigade to meet that scale. In order to make that argument, it would make sense for them to have that statutory duty. Would that not make your life easier within your department?
I have not seen any issue with the fire service response as it stands, I have to say. But again, that's my personal reflection.
Thank you. Don't know, Assistant Commissioner, if you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just on the part, because it's
Deputy Commissioner, sorry.
No problem at all. I think the issue around the statutory responsibility around flooding has been a live debate across the sector for some time. As Joe's already alluded to, it not having a statutory responsibility hasn't actually prevented us from being able to respond, and we prepare and train accordingly, expecting that we will deal with flood response when it comes. I think it still remains a live debate, the truth be told. The Fire Brigades Union have pushed very heavily for flood response to be included within a statutory responsibility. It's something the National Fire Chiefs Council has considered very, very closely, and I think there are significant arguments for it. But just to provide the reassurance that it doesn't actually stop us from providing the response, and is built into our strategic risk planning in the future, because whether or not it's a statutory responsibility, we will be responding to flooding events, and as we all know, and comments that you've made in the past, we know that we're going to be dealing with this on a more regular basis, and we need to plan and prepare accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to clarify my comments, I think it's amazing how the Fire Brigade will always step up to any challenge, it seems. But also, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree that we should be funding them properly to reflect that. Joe, I'll return to what I'm meant to be talking about now, which is the Manchester Arena inquiry. I've spoken on the committee before how I lost a close friend in the Manchester Arena bombing, and also Martin Hett, and the amazing work of Martin's mum that I think is well known nationally and has been commented on the committee before. Now, the government stated it won't respond to the recommendations from Manchester Arena inquiry until all three reports have been published. Why has it not responded to each as they've published, given the seriousness of the findings?
Again, I'm not able to comment exactly why, on the basis of all three. But again, my sympathies as well for the loss of your friend. I was part of the response on the night, because I used to head up the resilience team in the north, so my sympathies to all friends and family of the bereaved and injured. In terms of what's happening, the formal government response has not, not been formally published, has not stopped us moving forward looking at the recommendations as they have been published. And for example, again, going back to the work of my own department, our Stronger LRF work very much is following, has actually, preempted a lot of the comments that were in volume 2 of the inquiry around the role of the LRF, the role of the risk assessment, the role of following through lessons. It goes back to the point I made about assurance. It goes back to the point I made about leadership as well. So that the lack of that formal, consolidated government response has not stopped the response to the findings of the inquiry, Martin's Law being a case in point, and the superb work of Martin's mother. I am in awe of that woman, I have to say. So again, there is work going on already to take account of the recommendations from the inquiry. Obviously, the volume 3 was only published last week, and that very much focused on the security services, so I have very little knowledge on that basis. So the reassurance I want to give is that we are not waiting to do things. We are already doing things. And I say, I actually gave evidence at the public inquiry for Manchester, and part of the questioning and the recommendations, volume 2, very much underpin our Stronger LRF work on that. So I can speak to that.
Thank you. And do you have any indication when the government might respond formally?
I don't.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't. Sorry.
Now, the Resilience Framework Agreement, which you've already explained, isn't quite in your department, but it sets out some proposals for strengthening local resilience forums.
That's us.
Improving insurance.
I can answer that.
Brilliant. But I'm going back to the government. Have they undertaken any assessment of the impact of these?
We will, yes. It's that, in terms of what type of impact are you looking at? Equalities impact?
Yeah, exactly.
It will come through. Obviously, any legislation needs to have an equalities impact assessment. In terms of our work around the Stronger LRF work, that impact and the understanding of our communities, understanding of, and that's why we want to pilot our ideas, to get a range of LRFs to make sure that we know that obviously we want to include London, but we also want to include, two-tier authorities, want to include sort of more rural, the urban. So in terms of that, our pilots will be looking at those impacts. It's something we want to test and really want to understand, what difference will these changes make? The aim is to strengthen, but the pilots are there to test the ideas. So yes, we will be doing those impacts as well. It's all about trying to strengthen, how we think about and how we support communities. I think that's the critical thing. Resilience doesn't happen in isolation. It's about supporting communities to be able to be resilient and to be able to, to know where, and also to understand where some more support is needed, where more education is, where more training is needed. And I think I was particularly taken by Baroness Twycross's point about really helping to upskill and empower and build capacity and capability in the local authority space as well, because absolutely critical partners. Again, speaking personally, sometimes my concern about resilience is that our emergency service do the most fantastic job, and I'm brilliant. Sometimes the lines I hate are, and then we hand over to recovery. And that consequence management, that community support is something that I really want to strengthen. I really want to build into our thinking, and that's the local authority space. And again, having done a lot of support after flooding, I think that's where I see the work of the community foundations, the voluntary sector, the local authorities. I think that's something I'm really keen to build that. And that goes to the point about the impact and about understanding, who's been impacted, how are they being impacted.
Absolutely, and just a final supplementary on that, really. So the MAI was obviously about terrorism, but there's, I'm sure, lessons there to learn about climate. What do you think those kind of main lessons are? It's
about communication. It's understanding and bringing the community in to understand, what does this mean for me? What does it mean if I live in a floodplain? What do I need to do myself, but also what can we do as a society? Is that the whole of society lines is quite a strange one, because it's what do we mean by that? And I think it's around helping us to work with different communities, so that, and we saw it also, during COVID as well, where the communities who knew their own community, that's how the vaccination got delivered, knocking on doors by people who were known and trusted by the community. And that's where I think, to me, and I saw the work of the mayor, Andy Burnham, and also the leader of the council, the fantastic work they did in the aftermath of the arena bombing, talking to communities. And to me, that's vital in any emergency, any response, that there is that engagement with the community, that it's not being done to a community, it's with a community. Because unfortunately, we cannot always stop bad things happening, and the climate is something that is huge impacts. And I think it's working with our communities so that people understand the nature of the risk, and also we understand where the gaps are and what we need to do as central government, as local leaders as well.
Thank you, that's really clear. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move over to Assembly Member Moema, who's joined us online, to ask questions on the consultation on staircases and sprinklers.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everybody. My first question is for the Fire Brigade. So what fire safety issues are key for LFB in assessing whether a high-rise residential building should have a second staircase?
Well, good morning, and I think the key thing for us is that we first of all really welcome the consultation that's coming through around risk at height. The government's consultation around 30 metres we very much welcome, because what that will do is it will set a standard, whereas hitherto we've not seen that standard before, and obviously committee members here have spoken very passionately about the need to make sure that there is a standard when it comes to dealing with buildings at height. So we very much welcome that. Supported by the position that the Mayor has adopted as well, in terms of making that very clear around the 30-metre stipulation. So we very much welcome the consultation on the legislation that the government is proposing, which, as I say, also includes sprinklers. So sprinklers in care homes is something the Fire Brigade nationally as well as locally has pushed for some time. So we're really pleased to see that. I think what I would just say in addition to that is the National Fire Chiefs Council has spoken about 18 metres being married up with the risk that's contained within the Building Safety Act. So we think that actually there's some legitimacy in that to make sure that we've got synergy between the two. But I think the important thing for the committee, the important thing I think nationally as far as building standards are concerned, is that the 30 metres actually represents a standard that we can now see brought forward, which means we can hold people to account in a way that perhaps we've struggled to before. So we very much welcome the changes that are being proposed and look forward to working both locally and nationally to see that embedded in everything that we do.
Okay, thank you. And so just a quick follow-up on that. There are suggestions that moves to bring into scope buildings that are 11 to 18 metres. Is that, what are your views on applying the similar principle to those buildings?
So absolutely. I mean, our position will always be where we can see the introduction of increased mitigations, particularly at buildings at heights, whether it's 11 metres, 18 metres, at 30 metres. We are obviously very, very supportive of that. We need to work within the built environment that we face on a day-to-day basis to make sure that what is achievable can be delivered. But as far as the use of sprinklers is concerned, as far as the use of secondary stairwells are concerned, the safety case for both is very, very clear, and we will support that to see that introduced wherever it is possible to do so. Certainly obviously easier when it comes to new builds, to make sure that that's included in both the planning process and the building process, and we will want to have a view very, very clearly to make sure that our position is clear to the developers as these buildings are being developed and right across the whole of London and nationally. But our starting position will always be where we can see really good fire safety precautions right from the word go as far as the planning and building stage is concerned. We will welcome that, and that includes both sprinkler provision and the use of secondary stairwells to make sure that means of escape are protected, to make sure that where we can make sure that fire is extinguished when it's at its earliest stage, because clearly that's what we would want to see, and sprinklers have been proven to do that time and time again. We welcome that introduction as far as care homes is concerned. What we would also say, though, is we would like to see that introduced in schools as well. There was a consultation back in 2016, and that's not quite progressed as quickly as we would like to see it. So where we can, we see this consultation as being an incredibly important first step, but we would like to see that develop even more.
Okay, thank you. And I'd be interested in your views on what that would, on how that might work for the second staircases addition. Whether obviously there's a cost to do that retroactively on existing buildings, and sprinklers are much easier to retrofit to buildings. What your views are as the fire brigade on the existing buildings that we have in terms of managing the risk?
Well, I think as we've discussed at this committee a number of times before, we know, in a post-Grenfell world, we know the challenges that the built environment continues to pose to us. We need to make sure that we're working with local borough councils, that we're working with developers, that we're working with housing associations to make sure that the mitigations are in place that we need to see. So, as you say, when buildings are already in place, we need to make sure the mitigations that we can bring in around things like appropriate alarm systems, making sure that compartmentalisation is working as we would expect. All of those mitigations are in place. And then obviously when we see new builds coming forward, we want to see as much fire safety precautions being built into those buildings right from the word go, because it's much easier to make sure that those are in position from the word go rather than trying to retrofit them later on. But there is a big piece for the London Fire Brigade to do to make sure that we're working with local authorities, the planning committees, to make sure that our buildings are as safe as they possibly can be.
I just see Baroness Tricos wants to come in.
If that's okay, I just wanted to add that the most important thing in this place and sort of this discussion is around clarity. And I think in order to sort of make sure that we get the clarity, I think we really welcome the government's recent consultation announcement. It is a really important step change in the approach from government, and should, at the end of the consultation, provide the really clear guidance that is urgently required. I think paragraph 60 of the government consultation indicates the direction of travel, because it already encourages at this stage all developments to prepare for this change now in terms of the 30 metres piece and sort of the indication and the clarity about how that will go forward. So I think that with regards to buildings of lower heights, I know my colleague Tom Copley, who, as you're aware, covers building safety, continues to have discussions with colleagues in the GLA and the LFB on the most sensible approach to take. But I think that the clarity of guidance that's required and should be legislated for is one of the most important things now. At the moment, it's a bit of a muddle. People are confused about what might be required. So, and I think that the fire safety and the safety of the building's eventual users is central to everyone involved in building management, design, delivery and construction, and should be. And it's really welcome that the government's taking this forward. What we would be most keen to get back from government, though, is clarity around what is required, just so that people are really clear what is required, and so that we can move this discussion forward.
Thank you. My next question is to DLUC, please. And I am aware that you may not be able to reflect on a separate issue within your department about, who bears the cost for some of these actions, but the moves towards safety is really welcome. But I just wanted to ask you that given that the Mayor's already introduced a requirement for all residential buildings over 30 metres to have a second staircase, what's the government's position on this?
Thank you. And as you're probably aware, I'm not. My building safety colleagues are the ones who have the detail here, so I'm reluctant to sort of give a lot of information. I did sort of ask my colleagues in preparation, and again, so obviously the consultation is open, and that closes on the 17th of March. So in terms of the single stair issue, this is quite a complex area. So I must admit, I'm not really able to answer you effectively. I do not want to be giving you incorrect information or giving you an incorrect position. So if I could I defer that and I'm happy if you want to send me a question to put to my colleagues.
Yeah, I think Chair, it'd be helpful to have a written response to that from DLUC. I would just add that I hosted a couple of weeks ago a roundtable with G15, the 15 largest housing associations in London, and a majority of London boroughs, talking about housing and various other issues. And obviously, the 30 metres requirement, the second staircase requirement on buildings over 30 metres, is something that those landlord developers are working through. But I think some clarity around how that's balanced against the cost and who bears it and the responsibilities. And as Baroness Wycross has said, the clarity be really, really welcome. So I think I would welcome a written response, and I'm sure other members would as well.
Yes, thank you.
And my second question has been answered.
Okay, that's great. I'm now going to hand over to Assemblymember Hall, who had a supplementary question.
Thank you. Just a couple. As you know, I'm very keen on sprinklers, and also the second staircase, because we mustn't just. It's not just about the residents; it's about firefighters as well, and keeping them safe so that they can keep us safe. The first quick question is: how many of the fire brigade buildings are yet to be fitted with sprinklers?
So I'll just clarify, Assemblymember Hall, in terms of our own, own building, I would need to come back and write with a proper response to make sure I can give you an accurate number.
Because we can't tell everybody else they've got to retrofit when, mind you, at least the right people are on hand if we do have a fire. I suppose.
Your point's well noted. We'll write back with the detail.
The other quick one is what I know you've got very good enforcement powers, but what enforcement powers have the brigade got? As councillors, many of us go into high-rise buildings, and different front doors have been put on, and fire safety doors are propped open or, by other things. So the building won't react as it should do with the fire because of those things. So if it's reported to you that fire doors are wedged open, front doors have been changed, etc., and you can see drilling, which I'm sure all councillors can, drilling holes, which doesn't compartmentalise things. What actual enforcement
So we absolutely do have enforcement powers under the regulatory reform order, and it's something that our fire protection team in particular will do. So if one of the examples you've just given there, Assemblymember Hall, if we get one of those calls come in that there is what we refer to as an alleged fire risk, depending on the severity of it, because that could be dealt with actually by a local crew if they happen to be nearby and it's a very minor issue. So if someone's wedging open a fire door, for example, that's something we can advise that's dealt with quite quickly. If it's more fundamental than that, and if the building, in terms of the occupancy of the building, is much more high risk, then we will send our fire protection enforcement teams to go and have a proper look. And we do have that power, including prohibition notices, which we serve on it's called an Article 31 notice, which we serve on a fairly regular basis to make sure that we're managing the built environment as we need to.
So housing teams, etc., and councils and housing associations all know that if they see this constantly, they can get hold of you.
Oh, absolutely right. Yeah, it's one of our key roles in helping to manage the built environment is that enforcement action we can take if required.
So do you register how often you do that?
In terms of what? In terms of the building? In terms of the building itself?
If I said to you, how many times a year would your teams intervene?
So we capture all of that data in terms of the numbers of enforcement notices that we apply. We also count the number of alleged fire risks that we do. All of that information we do hold, and we'll be able to share that with you.
If you could share it, I think that would be useful.
I should just add, actually, they're part of our key performance indicators that will be included within the community risk management plan as well, so that actually people can see what we're doing, and we're being held to account against those key performance indicators. So we'll be able to share that data.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. This is now the end of the first section, so we'll take a 5-minute adjournment. And can I thank you all for your contributions? Joe, it was particularly interesting to hear from you and Colin, and your comments about communities not working in isolation and being supported in isolation are particularly welcome. So thank you very much. And we will take a 5-minute adjournment and be back here in the chamber with our second panel in 5 minutes. I'm going to run to the loo.
Yes, and I think we fixed the Zoom problem.
Welcome back to today's Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Can I welcome all our guests on our second panel, focusing on the role of local authorities in London's resilience and emergency planning. This morning, we have Baroness Twycross, Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, Jonathan Smith, Deputy Commissioner, London Fire Brigade, Toby Gould, Acting Head of London Resilience Group, Stuart Love, Chief Executive Officer of Westminster Council and Co-Chair of Local Authority Panel, London Resilience Forum, and Andrew Blake Herbert, Chief Executive Officer of Havering Council. We're now going to move over to Assemblymember Bakari, who's going to ask questions on the London Resilience Forum and local authorities.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start with the Deputy Mayor, Baroness Twycross. How do local authorities fit into the London's resilience structure?
I have to say, I can't imagine the structure without the local authority involvement. Boroughs are an essential part of the LRF, and I think that not only are they Cat 1 responders and as such subject to the full duties of the Civil Contingencies Act, they're a full and very active partner within the LRF, contributing to all the standing subgroups and working groups of the forum, and local authority chief execs also fulfil leadership roles, including Kim Wright, who's one of the deputy chairs of the LRF. And we've also got local authority leaders as senior responsible owners for a range of partnership capabilities. And those of you who had long conversations with me during the sort of periods we had of lockdown throughout the pandemic will know that there was considerable leadership from the local authorities. In fact, I think you chaired a number of the I can never remember what all the things were at various points, but you chaired the technical coordination group as well as other groups throughout. So, and Stuart was also responsible through his officers for managing the mortality management group through large parts of the COVID. So I cannot imagine the LRF without local authority involvement. I don't think we would be as effective as we're able to be.
Thank you. I've seen quite a structured way, a process of the way that everyone works together, but it must be quite a challenge to make sure that that it works properly. So I'm going to move on to Stuart Love, if I can. Can you tell us about the local authority panel and what being co-chair of the panel involves?
Yes, thank you very much and good morning. The local authority panel was established by chief executives in London with a view to ensuring that we were able to both interact with the LRF but also to drive standardisation and standards of resilience across London. The local authority panel is made up of chief executives that represent sub-regions within London. Those chief executives take a lead in those sub-regions on issues of resilience and emergency planning. And the local authority panel then ultimately ensures that we have an assurance process in place to assure ourselves that local government is best placed to deal with emergencies. So there's a preparedness responsibility there as well. As I've already said, driving standardisation across London's local authorities. And then also really importantly, to ensure that collectively we are able to deal with the humanitarian assistance side of any particular incident or emergency and how we come together to do that, facilitating mutual aid, etc.
Looking at the sector panels, it ranges from transport, business, health, voluntary groups, faith groups, blue lights, comms, all sorts of areas. So how does the local authority panel work with all of those different sectors and do it in a way that isn't confusing and making sure that everyone's voices are being heard and it's done in a way that is amplifying each of them?
One thing I should mention is, in addition to the local authority panel in the sub-regions, we also have borough resilience forums, and those are actually critical because when an incident happens, the relationships between all of the Category 1 responders are key. So most of those relationships are held at borough or council level. So those borough resilience forums are actually key to an emergency response.
So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the Borough Resilience Forum. How do you make sure that there isn't any repetition of anything, really, in terms of discussions or policy, and just making sure that it's not a wasted time for those particular groups?
You mean in preparing rather than in responding to an incident? So within the structure of the local authority panel, we have something called the LAP Implementation Group, or LAP IG, and that is made up of practitioners from across London, so London's local authorities, the people in our local authorities who do this as their day jobs. And the whole purpose of the LAP IG is to do exactly what you've just suggested, which is to try as far as possible avoid any duplication, but also something that's critically important to us. And Baroness Twycross mentioned this in the previous session, is learning from each other, learning from what goes on outside of London as well.
So I presume that the Borough Resilience Forum does make sure that all the boroughs have a very clear voice. But are there any voices that you think may not get as much access?
I'm not sure I'd say that there are voices that don't get as much access. I do think London is particularly complicated. I worked outside of London for 10 years, leading on resilience emergency planning in the local authorities I worked for outside of London. And London's, out of necessity, London is quite complicated in terms of its governance. And again, just picking up on something Baroness Twycross mentioned in the previous session, and the Department for Homes, Living Up Communities person who was here, what I think we would like to see in terms of London is, in addition to the investment in the LRF, some consideration given to local authorities as well, because we are all different, we are all sovereign, and we have different abilities to invest in our emergency planning responses.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the support you think that you could get from the LRG and the LRF? A little bit more about that.
We work incredibly well with the LRG, and as Baroness Twycross has said, the local authorities are a key part of the LRF. Kim Wright, who is the co-chair of the LAP alongside with me, is also deputy chair of the LRF. I think those relationships work well. If I was flagging a concern, it would be, I don't like playing the London is unique card, but I do think in terms of how government approaches this, they do need to look at London's structures and London's governance and think a little bit about that in terms of how they invest in emergency preparedness and response.
Are you talking about funding here? Is that what you're saying?
I think funding is part of it, yes. As I've said, we're all different, and we all have differing abilities to invest in our emergency response capability. And, as funding has become more and more stretched over the years, that has impacted on people's ability to invest in emergency preparedness. It's just a fact. So we would like government to consider funding for local government when it comes to emergency planning and resilience.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, are you satisfied that local authorities are playing an effective part? Now, you obviously praised and said how significant they are, but do you feel as if they are playing that effective part in London's resilience? Is there any concerns or anything you'd like to see different or change?
I think that it'd be wrong of me to say that we could never improve things. I think that, but one of the strengths of the LRF is the way that we do go through debriefs, we do lessons learned, and we work really closely. It's the relationships that you build up through time as well. So I think that reflecting one of the things that Stuart said in terms of the funding, we quite often, and it's a bit unfair to say it now that they've left, because I would have said it in front of them, they know it's something I've said before. London tends to get the same as somewhere, I think at times we've had the same funding in terms of the pilots as somewhere like Cumbria, with a much greater population and much greater risk to life. So I think that I'd rather see government funding proportionate to the size and complexity of London. That isn't to say that we don't welcome the funding for the pilots we've got, but would we like to see more? So, for example, LAP and the chief execs could invest more in capacity building. Yes, of course. But I think that that isn't to say that's not something we're already trying to do already.
You were praising the example of what it was like in terms of during the pandemic, and that was a unique situation. But can you give me any other examples where it has worked well, and also examples where things haven't gone too well, and what lessons we can learn from that?
So it's, I think that quite a lot of it is where you don't see things is where it goes well. So I think the local authorities are responsible for the humanitarian response. So I've been to see rest centres where it's almost seamless delivery to people who've been evacuated from their homes. So so that's where the local authority has practiced it. They've got their tabards on. People know who's responsible for what. They work very closely with voluntary sector organisations and so forth. So I think you don't hear so much about things when things go well. So I think that in most circumstances this happens, and as I mentioned, I think COVID is a extremely positive example of how this worked. Not to say we didn't have difficult conversations. I'd be lying if I said we didn't have difficult conversations, but we worked things through as a partnership and delivered, I think, as well as we could for Londoners across the piece, including sharing resources and sharing expertise across London, either through local authorities or people getting seconded to support local authorities, both from the LRG and actually in one case from the GLA as well. So I think there's a very obvious example where it didn't work quite so well, and I think that the most significant example for London is quite clearly the Grenfell Tower fire. And while the performance of local authorities in supporting the people affected by the fire is subject to the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the Phase 2 report hasn't come through, it's a matter of public record that the local authority response should and could have been better than it was. So I think that we have to learn from these occasions. We talked about the Manchester Arena inquiry in the previous part of the meeting. We also have to learn from experiences of other parts of the country as well. And as an LRF, I think that we don't stand on the praise we get from people. I think Joe Gillespie was very kind about the work and competency of the partnership in London. We're very clear that we also have to learn not just from things that happen in London, but things that happen elsewhere in the country, and actually things that potentially have happened overseas.
Thank you. And just back to Stuart, just on that point about Grenfell, that's when the sector panels must have been most important at that point in terms of, particularly, the faith groups. Like there was a particular faith group that, the Muslim community were, impacted more than any other group. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learnt from Grenfell in terms of the sector panels themselves?
Thank you very much. I think in terms of Grenfell, the key learning actually was about the local authority panel, in particular, whoever was the London Local Authority Gold at the time, the lead chief executive, should have been called in at a much earlier stage. So the local authority should have asked for help earlier. And the key learning that's come out of we did a review post Grenfell of the local authority response, and the learnings. The two key issues for us were, first of all, that an affected local authority asked for help at the earliest possible point, alongside the proactive offer that comes from the local authority panel and London Local Authority Gold. And the second thing was around humanitarian assistance. And again, that was a key failing within Grenfell. It's something for me that I have to say I found a little bit frustrating, because I think we have spent too often reinventing the wheel when it comes to humanitarian assistance. I was in London for the 7th of July bombings and was involved in the periphery at the time. Came back to London and then was directly involved in the Westminster Bridge bombings. And at the time, we did literally start again in terms of the humanitarian assistance piece. I think there have been positive moves, though. When the Manchester Arena bombing happened, we, because of our experience on Westminster Bridge, we got involved in working with Manchester around just, assisting with in any way we could around the humanitarian assistance piece there. And as I've said, it's a key learning for us on the back of Grenfell is how we improve humanitarian assistance and how we have a much better and more standard approach to that. In terms of working particularly with the panels that you mentioned, I didn't get involved in that at the time. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to comment on that.
There is anyone who can comment on that particular area, or maybe we can come back to that in terms of another additional question that we can send later on about that particular area. Okay, so just to wrap up, we're not discussing it today, but there was a gas explosion in Merton, where I'm a councillor, and you mentioned, Deputy Mayor, you mentioned the struggles of rehousing, and this is coming up again, in particularly in my area. What I've noticed is that it does stretch the officers in the councils themselves more than anything else, and that's the problem that I see. Stuart, what do you think?
I agree with you. That's the Galpins Road gas explosion. I was actually going to give that as a positive example of the learnings from Grenfell, where Merton Council did, within hours, reach out to through London Local Authority Gold and the LRG to the rest of London, asking for mutual aid and assistance, because they recognised very early on that they were not going to be able to deal with it on their own. And that's really a cultural point across London. So I personally thought that it was a very positive response from the council in seeking assistance. And I know that assistance was provided mainly from immediately neighbouring boroughs, because that was logistically easier, but there were offers of assistance from across London. So I know that there were challenges in the response to that. And as you said, it did put a lot of pressure on the local authority officers at the time, but mutual aid seemed to work well across the rest of London then.
But what's the delay in terms of housing and just responding to concerns that residents have? Why does that happen?
The delay in terms of being able to house people, that unfortunately, again, I'm not in a position to comment on that. It depends, I guess, on the nature of the incident and the length of time that people will have to be displaced as to what is appropriate from a housing perspective.
Yeah, you please do come.
Shall I come in on the back of that one, on the back of Wennington and the fire, where we had 19 homes that were totally destroyed? And you're absolutely right, there is a real shortage of capacity in housing in London. So finding homes that people can be moved to, if you think about the pressures with hotels that are being taken up through the Home Office, etc., that is a real challenge. We're not sat there with lots of empty houses that you can suddenly move people into when a crisis happens. So you do have to manage that in a structured way. People do have to go into hotels and temporary accommodation for a period of time. And you obviously have to continue to work not only with the residents but with the insurers that have insured the properties that they're living in as well, to make sure that the right responsibility is picked up in the right place. But housing pressure and housing demand is definitely a struggle when people have got to be rehoused as part of an emergency.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I know from experience that, and it happened with Grenfell, it happened with so many of these incidents, that you're going through a trauma as it is, you've lost everything, and then you're told that you can't live in the area that your kids go to school in, and you're moved away from the people that support you and help you. It's incredibly challenging, very, very difficult. But yeah, thank you very much for all of your answers.
Great. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Assemblymember Rogers, who's going to ask some questions on the Wennington fire and the local response.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so I think we're going to now sort of look at some practical application of some things we've been talking about with reference to the Wennington fire, which is, of course, absolute human tragedy with many people losing their houses. Maybe we start with you, Jonathan. Could you just briefly summarise the Fire Brigade's response to the Wennington fire on the 19th of July?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just echo those comments, actually, in terms of Wennington, you know, the human tragedy that unfolded there as far as how that fire spread. And what it really demonstrated was that urban-rural interface coming into stark reality when dealing with the conditions that we faced on the 19th of July, in particular, as we've discussed at this committee before. The incident at Wennington was actually one of 15 significant incidents across the whole of London on July the 19th, which London Fire Brigade had to respond to. As far as the Wennington fire specifically was concerned, we mobilised 15 appliances. There were somewhere in the region of 100 firefighters tackling that blaze within Wennington. It sat, as I've mentioned, within the context of a major incident that was declared by the London Fire Brigade in terms of the pan-London conditions that we were facing as an emergency service, as other emergency services were facing as well. I actually went to Wennington the day after, and you couldn't help but be completely moved by what I actually saw there in terms of houses completely destroyed, you know, people who've lost all of their worldly possessions, and the speed with which that fire spread was something that, if I'm honest, I haven't seen in 24 years in my fire service career, the way that it developed at Wennington specifically. Which is why we've conducted a major incident review. It's why the lessons need to be learnt as far as our posture as London Fire Brigade is concerned, because one of the elements that sits within that major incident review is that London Fire Brigade last year attended more wildfires than Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service. I think nationally, the only other service that attended more wildfires than we did was Mid and West Wales. So for colleagues who know that part of the world, that's a very rural area. So us as a brigade will need to be adjusting our posture, need to be adjusting what we do now, because we're obviously very well set up for dealing with the challenges of operating in an urban environment. But as what we saw last year has demonstrated very, very clearly to us, we also need to make sure that we've got that capability to deal with wildfires as we know we're going to face going forward, you know, this summer and beyond. And that was very visibly demonstrated by what we saw at Wennington.
So, I mean, what my question here is, what learning have you gained from this incident, and has that resulted in any change yet? So are you changing the way that you're preparing for potential wildfires this summer?
So the short answer to that is absolutely yes. So there's and this includes everything from the types of equipment that we're looking at to try and bring online, from the PPE that we're going to be using to make sure that firefighters have got the protection that they need. Big part of it is actually the training. Now, luckily, through the National Fire Chiefs Council, there is significant expertise which sits within the UK Fire and Rescue Service, and I've met with Paul Headley, who's the Chief Fire Officer up in Northumberland, who leads on wildfire for the National Fire Chiefs Council. There's a number of training packages that have been developed by the NFCC utilising national operational guidance that we'll be rolling out to our firefighters over the course of the next few weeks to make sure that we're as prepared as we can be for what we expect to see in the summer months in London. That will also include tactical and strategic command, because one of the lessons we learned on the day itself is that we will need to resource differently to make sure that we've got the availability of appliances and resources to be able to spread right across London, because, as I say, one of the unique things about what we faced on the 19th of July is that it wasn't just contained to one area of London. This was spread right across the capital, which posed significant issues for us, which is why we called a major incident. It's why we stood up our strategic response arrangements. And all of those lessons are being learned. As I say, the major incident review has just come forward. It's just going through our governance process at the moment, and that covers the whole gambit in terms of our operational response, our preparedness, our messaging, working very closely actually with local communities, that we're doing that preparatory work, that where you do have that urban-rural interface, there are actually precautions you can take before we get to the summer months that will help mitigate that. Now, internationally, that's well known. You know, if you go to places like Australia or in parts of southern Europe in particular, they're well versed in actually making sure that their rural-urban interface is being well managed, that there are actions that can be taken before you get to the wildfire season. And I think those are lessons that we're going to draw upon, and they're going to be included within our local borough risk management plans, which go live from the 1st of April this year, about trying to prevent where we can, but then absolutely being ready to respond where we know we're going to have to.
Thank you. Is that major incident review something you could share with us at the appropriate moment?
Yes, absolutely. I think it'd be useful for the committee to see.
I think
that.
it'd be very interesting. Thank you. So, could you tell us how you liaise with the council in an incident like this? We talked about where homes are destroyed and residents have been displaced. How do you manage your interaction with the council?
So this is one of the real important learnings, I think, certainly post Grenfell, in terms of some of the criticism that was levelled against London Fire Brigade, was the fact that we perhaps stepped back when we should have stepped forward as far as that engagement with the local councils are concerned, and more importantly the local communities. And these are lessons that we've been learning to make sure that we've got that interface right, and that actually London Fire Brigade's response doesn't just stop once you've actually dealt with the incident itself. Actually, you need to be there and you need to be present going forward. Now, one of the things I was particularly pleased to see at Wennington is that there was a visible and physical fire service presence for the next 28 days at Wennington, to make sure that we were working very closely with Havering Borough Council. We are now including, actually, as part of our incident command structure, a specific officer role to do that community and borough council liaison, even when we're doing the response part of the incident. Because, as I say, once the response is actually where it needs to be and the incident has been resolved, we cannot take a step back. We have to make sure that we're there working with the local borough council, working with the voluntary sector, local charitable organisations, to make sure that actually communities have got the support that they need. Because a lot of the time, and this was certainly the case in Wennington, people want reassurance. They want reassurance, they want support. We needed to have a fire service presence there anyway, because the heat wave continued obviously beyond the 19th of July, and we were seeing hotspots popping up. Even when I was there, actually, we mobilised a couple of times to deal with particular incidents that were popping up. So this is one of the key drives in terms of London Fire Brigade's overall improvement process, that we make sure we get community recovery right, and that we are one of the key agencies working with our partners to be there when they need us. Because when you are dealing with something particularly as widespread as what Wennington faced, you have to make sure, as one of those key London institutions, that we are there working with our partner agencies and working with the local community to recover as quickly as possible.
And what does that actually look like? So you have your officer assigned to the sort of post-incident response. What are the demands on that person? What are they being asked to do and look into and respond to?
So they'll work very closely with, as I say, the Borough Council. It's also key agencies like the Environment Agency and others, to make sure that we've got the right advice. Because a lot of the time you'll find that communities are seeking specific advice. They've got concerns about what this actually means, even down to things in terms of the time it's going to take for them to get back into their houses. All of these sorts of questions that people legitimately raise. How can they go and get medications, for example, that are in people's houses? So it's working very closely there. We've got a very good borough structure where you have a local borough commander who has got relationships, and I know Paul McGlenaghan, who is the borough commander in Havering, has been working very, very closely with the local borough there to make sure that those connections remain, and we have a physical presence. Because one thing we can do is be a very visible sign of reassurance to the community, which is something we need to make sure we develop further. And that is included in our borough risk management plans, that is a key role for us, that we don't just stop once the incident has concluded. We are there providing advice and guidance and support to the local communities, which is something that they've asked for, rightly so.
And how do you manage your interaction and maintaining relationships across multiple local authorities, which is what you were having to do on the 19th of July? As you said, these incidents were all over London, not just focused on Havering.
I think this is where our structure actually really helps. So, as I say, we have a borough commander in a London borough who already has those relationships with the communities and with the local authorities, to make sure that those relationships are already well embedded before we actually get to this incident, because that's really, really important. When you're dealing with these incidents, this isn't the first time you want to meet your counterparts in other agencies. You want to have had those relationships embedded over many years prior to that, to make sure that exists and it's as seamless as it needs to be. And as I say, the way London Fire Brigade is actually postured helps that, if I'm honest, that you've got a local borough commander, you've got the station commanders rooted within the local communities. That helps build those forums. And again, all of that is being properly formalised now within these borough risk management plans, which, as I say, go live on the 1st of April.
Yeah, I will say that my 3 borough commanders I know are fantastic about building those relationships. So you know, when something does happen, you're not going from a standing start. So how are you continuing to work with Havering? We're coming up to, well, not far off, a year on from the incident. What's your work looking like with Havering?
Well, as I say, Paul McGlenaghan has been working very closely with Havering Borough Council, including providing things like there's fire safety advice that's being given to local communities there, making sure that that physical presence is out. They even ran on Halloween, they ran a sort of a Halloween party at the fire station, which raised about £3,000, I think it was, for the local community recovery. It's that sort of thing, and constant engagement with both the communities and key partners, which is something we want to see embedded, which is why it's one of those key elements within the borough risk management plans underneath our overarching community risk management plan, that this is actually business as usual for London Fire Brigade. We work very, very closely with all of the partners because we do have a real offer there in the post-recovery phase of an incident. It's not just about the incident itself, it's how you make sure that you are firmly embedded in all of the local institutions as well as the pan-London institutions, and all of that is coming through in our strategic planning as we work our general improvement process over the next sort of years to come.
Thank you. A question now for Toby. Could you, when we have a major incident like this, how does the LRG support the setting up of a strategic coordination group?
Thank you. If I can. Thank you. If I can, I'll try and touch on the earlier question about how the other sectors come in as well. But we have a published document that's available online, the Strategic Coordination Protocol. That's the main document that sets out how the Resilience Partnership responds to an emergency at a strategic level. So I'll explain it briefly, and obviously happy to go into more detail if you'd like me to. Otherwise, it's good to signpost to that document. So it's deliberately flexible, so that the same sort of coordination arrangements can be applied, whether it's in this case not just the terrible fires that affected people's lives that day, but also that was by that stage I think a good week into the heat health emergency, with significant impact on the lives of a lot of people in London and elsewhere. So when an incident occurs, we basically, it's called a tripartite call, but we have a telephone conversation between the agency that's raising the issue. So in this case, if we talk about the fires specifically, that would be with London Fire Brigade, someone from either me or someone from my team, London Resilience Group, and someone from the Metropolitan Police, who are the sort of lead agency for strategic coordination arrangements. So those 3, or in some cases, depending on the circumstances, 4 or 5 organisations will have a very quick conversation to decide what level of coordination needs to be established. We have 3 levels, and the first one is very simple, that we monitor the situation and share information. And to give a flavour of what that, what sort of incident that's for, so today we've been doing that, and yesterday we've been doing that for the cold weather that we're experiencing today and the alerts for later in the week. And that may be all we do, and we do things like share reminders of actions for different agencies and the latest briefing, in this case from the Met Office, with the whole of the partnership, and basically we keep an eye on things. The next level up, we can hold a partnership teleconference, and that's specifically to enable all partners to not just hear those sorts of briefings firsthand from, as today is the case, the Met Office, for example, but to give them the opportunity to A, ask questions to clarify their understanding of the situation, and B, to raise any issues, which is another means of gathering more situational awareness and determining what the partnership might need to do to respond. And then often the far easier decision, because it's normally self-evident, is to convene a full strategic coordinating group. And then in terms of what London Resilience Group does, so we're part of that decision-making process, and then we're part of supporting the setting up of that strategic coordinating group. Would you like me to go into more detail about exactly what we do to support the group? Or
yes, please. Yeah, thank you.
We have an aim, which is to support effective strategic coordination arrangements. So once we've got to that point of agreeing to set up a strategic coordinating group, that's when we have 1, 2, 3 sort of areas of work that we get involved in. So firstly, facilitating shared situational awareness through something called a common operating picture. So we have a web-based platform that we use in most cases for this, and that enables every organisation in the partnership, regardless of how heavily involved they might be in that particular incident, to post information about what their view is of the situation, what their assessment is of their own organisation's response to that emergency or major incident or situation, what their forward look is, and what their organisational strategy is. So all of that comes together through a web-based system that can then be printed off, or these days not often printed off, but a sort of time-stamped version of that picture to inform a strategic coordinating group meeting, so that everybody has the same level of awareness going into that meeting. So that's the first thing that we aim to do on behalf of the partnership. The next one is we offer advice to the SCG chair, and that very much depends on the nature of the incident and who the SCG chair is. If it's if it was a counter-terrorism incident and a Met Police commander chairing that group, then their primary source of advice, and we certainly won't be us. They'll be looking more within policing circles for that advice. So that really depends. But we're there as a group of resilience professionals who work on London's capabilities, risk assessment on a day-to-day basis, and that's what we try to offer advice on: is what's the relevant framework or capability, and what's the relevant thing that the partnership should be looking to achieve. And then the third one is the secretariat, but if you think of it as the administrative function. So we always say we do that in conjunction with the lead agency, and that's purely because my team is on a sort of 2-hour or up to 2-hour call-out period to respond. So we like, for resilience purposes, to never say we'll just do this on our own. But that typically we do very well, and we respond much quicker than that 2-hour period. But that's inviting people to the meeting, putting the paperwork to that first meeting, and in some cases secretariating subgroups and doing that sort of work in support.
And with the specific example of Wennington, when did the SCG sort of step up? Who chaired it? How often did it meet? When did it stand down? So how does it practically work?
So Wennington, I mentioned, we're already several days into the heat health emergency. So I've got some of those dates here actually. But so a partnership teleconference, that second level that I talked about of sharing information, briefing, information sharing, but not necessarily a full strategic coordinating group coordinating a response. So that partnership group was meeting from the 13th of July, so 6 days before Wennington. And then, again, it wasn't because of the fires, although fire risk was considered in these meetings, but that strategic coordinating group, chaired by a commander from Met Police, met then on the 15th, the 16th, the 17th and the 18th of July. And so that meant that on the 19th of July, effectively, the SCG was already up and running and active, and had its own programme of work, if you like. So on the 19th, SCG meetings were held at 11:30, 5 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. And there were some other calls, that partnership calls that took place, particularly and specifically in relation to the wildfires during the course of that afternoon. And then it continued to meet, so 10 a.m. on the 20th of July, and then I think the last partnership meeting during that response phase was 2 p.m. on the 20th of July.
Okay. Was it chaired by the Met Police throughout?
I think the SCGs were all chaired by the Met Police. I could double check and make sure that's correct, and get back to you. The partnership teleconference, the last one, was probably chaired by our team. So we tend to chair a lot of those partnership level teleconferences where they are just for information sharing and not for coordinating the response and making strategic decisions.
Thank you very much. I think I'll turn now to Andrew to talk about Havering Council's response. Could you tell us how the Council initiated its response to this incident, including how you worked with the SCG?
Yeah, thank you. So we instigated our normal responses to an emergency in terms of setting up our gold, silver and bronze structures and feeding into the main responder, which in this case was obviously the London Fire Brigade. So we worked very closely alongside them with people off-site doing the coordination, but our Silver Command working very much on-site in Wennington with the Fire Brigade, and then working through the incident as it went through during the afternoon, through into the evening, when obviously we had to set up the rest centre and be able to support the residents in the right way, and continued on through the days and actually weeks and now months, because we are still supporting those residents to this day. And you made a very important point earlier about kind of that 1 year anniversary is not that far away now, and we'll be moving back into warm weather season as well, so memories for people will come back as part of that process. So we continue to support residents as we go forwards at the moment.
And you mentioned Silver Command was actually on site. Who within the council takes up that role of Silver Command?
Yep. Under our responsibilities, we have what are called LALOs, which are local authority officers that respond on those situations. We use those as our Silver Command. We have a clear set of structures about who's on gold, who's on silver, which bronze groups I'll come back to, because that depends on the nature of the incident. But those gold and silvers are set up. We have a plan forward for the coming year, so we know who will be on response and who will pick up incidents when they happen. I think one of the challenges with an incident of the nature of Wennington, and it's certainly one of our key learnings, is about we have a fantastic group of staff who absolutely want to step up and respond in these situations, but they also want to see it through. And when you're there for 3, 4, 5, as in this case 6 days, and those staff are working 20-hour days during that period, there does come a point where they become fatigued and you need to do the turnover and bring fresh people in. But some of them are so passionate about what they do, they don't want to let go. They want to see it through. They've built up those relationships with the residents and they want to keep going. So that's certainly one of our key learnings in terms of making sure we do that process of refreshing staff and making sure that turnover happens. But working through those processes, then depending on the incident, we will work out which bronze groups we needed to step up behind in terms of the support, depending on the nature of the incident. Obviously, for this one, the big part for us, for local authorities, is about that the recovery process and about returning the community to, I'm going to use the word normal. Normal is not the right expression in this case, in terms of the incident and what happened, and the impact that that's had on people's lives.
Thank you. My colleague will have some questions specifically about the recovery shortly. But this, of course, an incident like this, multifaceted, multi-agency, involving all kinds of different organisations. How did you work with your Borough Resilience Forum partners on this incident?
So I think the really important part there, and Jonathan spoke about this earlier, is that bit about those relationships, and they're absolutely crucial. I think if I give you one example about the following morning, and it was Darren, and I've forgotten Darren's surname, apologies, Paul, who was the lead fire officer for the incident. But on the following morning, he and I met with all of the residents that have been impacted on a one-to-one basis. We had meetings in what I would describe as 3 groups: those that had properties in the village but weren't impacted, and we were able to talk to them collectively, and then on one-to-ones after. Those that were impacted but maybe not as severely as some others, and then those that had lost everything as part of the fires. And what we were able to make sure we had around were the relevant teams, so support from partners from the voluntary sector, who are absolutely crucial, but also colleagues from health in terms of well-being and mental health support for people, and housing teams, etc. and people from our customer service centre that could give people advice on, you've lost all your documents and all your records, how do you get a new bank card, etc., etc. So making sure, I'm going to call it a one-stop shop almost, response was there at our rest centre to be able to give people the right support they needed.
That's fantastic, but I can imagine those must have been personally challenging meetings for the staff involved, so thank you very much for doing that for our residents. Have you, this is obviously a major incident, you've touched on some of the learning that has come out of it, but what other learning has come out of it, both for yourself and for the partners that you've been working with?
So I'm going to start with one bit of learning around councillors. So this incident obviously happened in July, not long after the local election, and what the learning for me was about making sure we train all councillors as quickly as possible in terms of the approach around emergency planning. So the ward that Wennington was in had 3 new councillors, and they all wanted to do the right thing by their residents, but unfortunately did cause some confusion in terms of where the rest centre was going to be, how that was going to work. So one of the key pieces of learning for me is very, very early on with new councillors, make sure they've got that learning, make sure they've got that understanding, make sure we've got those connections that if there is an incident, we can get messaging out as quickly as possible. In terms of the next parts of the learning, it was very much that bit about kind of my staff and making sure we had that change, and we did actually say to people, no, we are going to change you. We're going to bring somebody else in, and we're going to do that turnover. Building on that, I think the other key part for us that we're reflecting on is around kind of our planning and our advice. As was spoken about by Jonathan as well, it's a fairly unique area in terms of urban, but also open space, privately owned open space, and making sure there are the necessary advices going out to residents about how they look after their properties, how they can keep themselves safer in terms of things being a certain distance away from their home. And also in terms of us thinking about our environmental policies as we go forwards, in terms of thinking about things such as fire breaks, and how that builds through in terms of future developments. Although there was a road, a 2-lane road in the middle of the village, and the fire did jump that road from one side of the road to the other side of the road. So it's not an easy one to pick up on. It was a unique set of circumstances there on that day with the wind and the heat at the same time, that did add to the nature of the fire and the outcome that came about.
Thank you. And finally from me, have you and your partners, have you taken part in any exercises to test your response to major incidents?
Yes, as part of our emergency planning process, we carry out a what I'll call a major incident rehearsal each year. But that incident will vary depending on what we think are the key concerns. So this year, from a Havering Council perspective, I can say our incident's going to be about data and data security, and a breakdown of our position. But we have carried out incidents in the past about major fires, about pandemics, etc. So that's a key part of making sure our team are as resilient as they possibly can be when a situation comes along.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you. Toby, if I can just pick up with you, we were talking about that you go from kind of briefing education to a teleconference to a strategic coordinated, full strategic coordinated group. When you're at teleconference stage, you said that the group tends to chair that themselves. Would there be a benefit to bringing people in at that point?
Sorry, that's me not making myself clear, so apologies. So London Resilience Group is my team. There's about 20 of us in terms of full-time officers, and we can add to that. So we will often chair a partnership teleconference, that level 2 I was talking about, but that will be a full complement of the partnership, or of all relevant partners and sectors. So there's a standing invitation to most core members of the partnership, and then we tell everybody else, the whole of the rest of the partnership, at the same time, so that anybody else can raise their hand and say, actually, we do have an interest in this one. Can we participate? So in some cases, there's a default lead agency who would chair a partnership teleconference for that, but in most cases it's chaired by London Resilience Group, and in part that's so that the lead agency, so if we looked at a severe weather example, effectively we're facilitating that meeting so that agencies such as the Met Office, UK Health Security Agency, Environment Agency can brief in and provide the detailed and expert information to that group. So in a way we kind of take that responsibility so that an already busy agency isn't asked to pick up the chairing or facilitating of that group at the same time. And whose decision is it to upgrade or whatever the terminology might be to a full strategic group? So it's that same tripartite group of organisations. So London Resilience Group, the Metropolitan Police, and if we stick with severe weather, that would also normally include, depends on the nature of it, but the Met Office, the Environment Agency, and the UK Health Security Agency, because of the health impacts of severe weather emergencies. As I say, the tricky decisions are more about to what extent are we going to monitor, don't we convene a meeting at short notice. It's far easier, it's normally decided itself if it's it's just clear if you need a full strategic coordinating group. And I know questions have been asked about the flooding response as well. That's one of the things that changed after the July 2021 floods, is a more proactive convening of both all of the structure really, but those conversations about what's required through the tripartite call, a partnership teleconference or an SCG. So we have firmer and sooner triggers to activate some of those arrangements. That's good to hear, thank you. Deputy Mayor, if I can turn to you just for a moment. Andrew was just talking about fire breaks and talking about roads, although they weren't an effective fire break. Of course, my antennae went up. Andrew wasn't suggesting this, but I don't want to build more roads, particularly as fire breaks, particularly when we know emissions are partly a cause of the fires in terms of systemic change. What work are you doing, presumably with Shirley Rodriguez, to make sure that biodiversity is being protected while still managing these issues?
Yeah, so you're quite right. I'm working very closely with Shirley Rodriguez on this, and actually having been to see what happened at Wennington a couple of days after the fire, I actually suggested that Shirley go as well, because I think it was one of the first examples of having that wildfire effect and that jumping across things that we would assume were natural breaks. And I think it's the first time we've seen it to that level in London. There might be smaller sort of examples. So I think that we're taking it really, really seriously. So I think that so there's two aspects really in terms of looking at some of the climate change adaptation work we could look at. So there's heat risk. So what do we do with existing homes and buildings? So the Mayor's already promoting heat mitigation measures such as solar shading and ventilation within the warmer homes, retrofit accelerator homes and the retrofit accelerator workplaces programme. And it's a London-wide issue that's also the case in other cities, both in the UK and globally. The Mayor's commissioned research support guidance into retrofit measures with a view to create cooler homes and buildings. For new buildings, developers are expected to use the London Plan's cooling hierarchy to mitigate overheating risk. And we've also commissioned research on heat risk in London to identify what more can be done. The Affordable Homes Programme, running from 21 to 26, introduced 6 new sustainability requirements which set minimum standards, including the management of heat risk. And I think despite these efforts, I think local authorities face serious funding gaps in sort of funding adaptation to climate change, which we would be really keen for government to address urgently. And I think it's one of the ways that government money could be used quite effectively if it was made available. We've already spoken both in the committee and offline about some of the work on surface water flooding, and I think that there's two sides, and there's heat and then what happens after the heat, and we had been anticipating surface water flooding might be an issue to a great extent after the heat incident last summer. And following the serious flash flooding in July 2021, the Mayor convened a round table which brought together all those with statutory responsibilities, and those without statutory responsibilities. We've already covered the LFB not having that statutory responsibility, and in answer to the question several questions ago, it would just help clarify it if the LFB had that statutory responsibility to respond to flooding, in my view. And through the round table and actually through the task and finish group that followed, so sometimes these round tables sort of set off a whole stream of work. Stakeholders worked on the key short-term and longer-term actions needed to improve both the emergency response to surface water flooding, but also what we could do to sort of mitigate things going forward. So the group's now developing the first ever citywide surface water flooding strategy, and there's a group in place, and I think they're making good progress, and there's people with statutory responsibilities are sitting on that to look at what more is needed to continue to take forward immediate actions to reduce flooding. I could go on. I've got quite a long list of other things, from the London plan policies to the leaflets to basement properties that went out in the summer, which I hope the committee's seen. But if you haven't, we can forward it. Very targeted comms. I think sort of central to the resilience framework is what kind of communications do you need to do to the public, the people who are at most risk from surface water flooding, and that means not just risk to their property but risk to life, are those living in basement properties. So 45,000 leaflets were put out to basement properties, probably including some people in Westminster, basically highlighting the risk and what they could do to increase their own personal preparedness towards it. But we'll make sure you get a copy of the leaflet. And the Mayor's Green New Deal programmes are looking at things like sustainable drainage and funding programmes like the Green and Resilient Spaces, which are sort of putting funding into projects like Sudsinn area identified as being at highest climate risk. So, and I think there's only so much we can do without sort of more action from government. So we're really keen for government to support, as I said earlier, to install shading, better ventilation and use of reflective or green roofs alongside insulation. But a lot of this is around public-facing comms. So what are we saying to the public in relation to what we know is already happening? So I think that that point that was made about the combination of the weather being unique or sort of unprecedented. It's no longer unprecedented. We've already seen it. So how do we communicate to the public that this isn't just a one-off without sort of scaring people? And that's sort of the eternal problem with comms around resilience, is actually people are already scared. People already know there's a problem. So the more we can do to communicate the risk, what they can do individually, and then continue to work as a partnership, but also sort of highlight to government what more we think could be done sort of nationally, the better prepared we can be as a city, but the better prepared individuals can be as well. So that's a very rapid run through, and I've got more on the list, but I suspect that the committee's keen to move on with the meeting.
That was really extensive, thank you. And thank you also for the climate maps, the flooding maps I've been pushing the Mayor on as well last year.
Really useful. Yeah.
Andrew, if I can turn to you, do you believe that the London Resilience Group is effective? Sorry, I should say the structure rather than the group. That sounds like a very pointed question.
In terms of process and in terms of support, absolutely. Every scenario and every situation when there is emergency is different, and we will always take learning from every scenario, and I think that's really important that we build on that as we go forwards, that learning is a key part of what we do. But certainly if I reflect back to the fires at Wennington and the support that was there and in place for us, if I think about the dangerous structures in terms of buildings, we'd had 19 buildings that were completely burnt out, and they were a danger in terms of collapsing. We don't have many dangerous structures officers within the council, so calling out to the London Resilience Forum to ask for support from other boroughs was a key part in making sure that we got that collective support we needed to be able to respond. So it absolutely worked in that situation.
Right, and are there any improvements that you would like to see?
I think the key bit is for all of us, and it's not just about the Resilience Forum, but it's about, as Stuart was talking about earlier, within individual local authorities, is that collective capacity, which does come back to funding. I won't go into local authorities and their funding as one of the lowest funded in London, but you know, we've had 10 plus years now of austerity. And I will absolutely say some of that's a good and positive thing in terms of making local authorities more efficient, more commercial thinking in terms of what they do and what they operate and how they operate. But coming out of the pandemic, the increase in demand that we're seeing for services, there is a real pressure point at the moment, and there is lack of resource to be able to provide services appropriately. So making sure we've got that collective support, we can rely on each other, and we support each other when situations like this come along is absolutely key.
And with that, I very much take the point the Deputy Mayor articulated so well in terms of governments need to fund councils properly. But in terms of your risk register in Havering, do you feel like that's set up to tackle the climate emergency?
So I think the key one for me from a Havering perspective is finance would be very top of our risk register. We have the oldest population as a percentage in London, and the census has shown we've had the second fastest growth in children numbers in the country. So the demand for social care and the cost pressures that we face are immense at the moment. That obviously places a pressure when councillors are making decisions about the overall budget envelope and what services can and can't be provided. So absolutely looking at that level of resource, looking at the options that are there in terms of making sure we've got the right funding to be able to respond to these incidents is absolutely crucial. And it's not just the capacity on the day, it's actually the capacity to be able to support residents beyond. So if I just reflect back to Wennington Fire, we have a number of properties where residents had no insurance at all. And if I think about one of the sets of mews of properties that were burned down, one of the properties in the middle of the mews has no insurance. You can't, the insurers for the other households can't rebuild their own homes because the one in the middle does not have a solution. So the council is again having to step in and pick up that kind of gap where that situation exists.
Right, and we see this with flooding as well, the concern around insurance. So I guess my final question to you is, are you confident that Havering is prepared for any future events?
Can I give you a guarantee? No. Because we genuinely don't know what a future event would be, the size and scale of that future event. Can I sit here and say with my hand on my heart, I am as confident as I can be that we will be able to respond to a situation in the same way that we did to Wennington? Absolutely. Am I confident that if we didn't have that level of resource, as Stuart described earlier, that we would ask for help through London Resilience? Absolutely. I guess it's the size, scale and nature of the demand that's put on London collectively. If we think about the size of the fires that were going on across London on the 19th of July last year, there becomes that bit about, do we collectively have enough response to be able to respond to multiple incidents simultaneously?
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And we're just going to move on to our final section, which is, again, still on the Wennington fire, but about the recovery, which is led by Assemblymember Bailey.
Still just about good morning, panel. I'm going to start with you, Andrew. I really want to focus on recovery. A number of the points in my questions have been answered, so we'll adjust as we go on. But let me just start with a sort of baseline question. Can you tell us about Havering Borough's Resilience Forum's role in supporting Wennington and its residents to recover from the major incident last July?
So, absolutely. So the local authority role is to support residents during the recovery period. That's absolutely where local authorities come into emergency situations. And we set up our bronze structure. We set up our recovery board, which was a key part of our emergency response tactical group. And that went live on the 27th of July. So a number of days after the incident, because we were still working on the ground with the fire brigade and with the police in terms of managing the situation there. As was described earlier, we were still getting hotspots actually a week after the original fire. So making sure residents were safe, weren't returning to their homes and to the village sooner than was sensible was a key part. So our recovery board started meeting from the 27th, and there were 5 subgroups of our recovery board. One was about site management, accommodation and rebuilding. One was about health, mental health and well-being. One was about street care and highways. The 4th one was about the community, the voluntary sector and raising donations. And the final one was about communications and how we got messaging out to the residents that were directly affected. And those boards met on a daily basis, and they took through the issues and challenges that were being faced as part of that process. We had 19 properties that were destroyed completely. We had 119 residents that were supported. That was out of about 250 that were impacted, that were supported via our assistance centre, and 9 residents where the council was required to provide temporary accommodation because they needed somewhere to be able to stay and live beyond the first night where they stayed in the rest centre.
Okay. Can you tell us what the current position is of your residents who lost their homes entirely?
Try and give you an update on that one. So of the residents that lost their homes, as I say, 19 homes were lost entirely. 18 of those were classed as dangerous structures that had to be destroyed and pulled down. And we've continued to work with those residents and continue to work with them now in supporting them around making sure, one, their insurance companies are doing what's needed in terms of getting them new accommodation, but also in terms of making sure that their families' health and well-being is taken into account. So if I give you one example, we worked very, very closely with the children that were directly affected as we got through to the end of August and they were getting ready to return to school. So they were able to return to school in the best, the most normal way under the circumstances that was possible at that point in time. We still have one family that is currently living in temporary accommodation, but he says, not with his fingers crossed, but knowing that we've now got a solution for them, within the next 2 weeks they will be moved to a more permanent solution. The challenge we have at the moment is rebuilding the village, rebuilding the homes, and as I mentioned earlier to one of the other questions, we have a number of properties where there was no insurance, where the council is currently having to look at what options we put in place to help those residents to be able to rebuild their homes and return to where they used to live.
What costs in the recovery mission fell to you, and did you receive any support from the government to help cover those costs?
So we instigated a large number of processes, obviously at the time. In particular, it was about helping residents in the immediate aftermath of the event. So placing skips in the road to enable them to dispose of fire-damaged properties, putting up hoarding around properties where there was a concern in terms of the structural integrity of the building and the potential for the collapse. And the council's picked up and managed those costs itself as part of that process. There is a scheme called the Bellwyn scheme, which is a national scheme to be able to reclaim money. But the costs, I believe, I can't remember the figure, someone might correct me in a minute, have to be greater than £350,000 to get to that point. Our costs weren't at that level. We've spent somewhere in the region of about £150,000 responding to the situation directly, ignoring obviously officer time and officer cost. So that's a cost that the council has had to bear and burden itself.
Okay. Can I just quickly come to you, Toby, and can you explain the role of the Strategic Coordination Group in the recovery from a major incident and how its decisions are made to stand down?
Yeah, certainly. So, well, the first thing to say is that the Strategic Coordinating Group, there's a standing agenda, and somewhere towards the bottom of that standing agenda, even from the first meeting, is recovery. So the idea is that from the very first stage of an incident happening, that Strategic Coordinating Group will have an eye at least on what that longer term recovery might look like. simply because it may well affect decisions that are made about the initial response, so to ease recovery in the longer term. So if it's a scale of an incident that requires a regional recovery coordinating group, that will start as one of the subgroups of the SCG. So typically it will be led by a local authority chief executive or another gold level officer, and then effectively you have a subgroup whose job it is just to focus on recovery and report into each of the ongoing strategic coordinating group meetings. And I did say earlier I'd try and explain how some of the other sectors fit in. And I've been looking at the structure diagrams and trying to think of the easiest way to explain that, because it is by its nature quite complicated. But we have our strategic coordinating group to set the strategy, make decisions, set priorities. And that group will decide to implement various other pieces of work. And each one of those gets its own subgroup, and each subgroup has its own composition of agencies. For a sizable emergency, you would have a strategic coordinating group, and then you might have beneath it certainly a London Resilience Communication Group for the public communications coordination, a recovery coordinating group led by local authorities, but from my experience, recovery coordinating groups tend to have an even greater number of organisations represented on them than a strategic coordinating group, because of the nature of recovery and how far efforts need to go to try and support people. And Andrew's mentioned some of the subgroups. You just do tend to get a lot more engagement from and direct engagement from community voluntary groups and others alongside the core resilience partnership. And then you might have other subgroups next to it: humanitarian assistance, mass fatalities, and so each of those sectors, each relevant sectors, if we took transport for example, will be represented on each of those groups. So it's structured around senior decision making or multi-entity decision making, that SCG, and then it's the themes of what we're trying to achieve and which organisations need to be part of each of those work streams.
Thank you. Just one other small question to you, Toby. What learnings have you taken from having to deal with major fire? Because fire for London has largely been an urban pursuit, and this was felt semi-rural or rural, depending what your take is. Was there anything different that you took from this incident that you'll now keep here as part of your learning?
Well, so on behalf of the partnership, it's the, I think it's the relatively obvious one about being more alert to the risk of wildfires and the nature of those fires within London. So as a partnership, we'll be looking to revise our risk assessment information and looking to revise what arrangements the partnership has in place. Those arrangements, the response then comes from the relevant agencies. So in this case, I know Jonathan's already spoken to the London Fire Brigade's learning processes, and that's where I think the detail comes in terms of learning about those fires and preparing to respond to them, what steps can be taken to help prevent and mitigate them, and how the response works.
Thank you. If I just come to Jonathan, have any fire prevention measures been put in place? Because you made the comment earlier on that sort of urban, suburban crossover then out into rural. Have we done anything different? Because I live out that way, and it seems to me that we were just surprised that we would have any kind of wildfire. Of all the conversations I've had as a London Assembly member, as a local, wildfire has been in none of them until we had the wildfire. So was that part of it? It was just a new situation for us.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that. So, we have faced wildfires in London in the past. There've been significant incidents. Wanstead Flats being probably the most recent example. I think, as has already been discussed, the way that this fire developed, particularly the way that it leapt and moved at such pace, was something that we hadn't seen before. It's where some of the international learning is critical, because if you look at things like vegetation management, that is a key area in terms of making sure that you manage the rural interface in a much better way. So there is advice that we're looking to develop at the moment, which we're going to be communicating through local borough structures around how we actually manage vegetation, that there are natural fire breaks. If I'm honest, this is a big communications piece. It's around behaviour as well as actually physical change. You know, not having barbecues in Parkland when the weather is really hot. You know, banning portable, disposable barbecues. It's that sort of element, making sure you're being very careful with rubbish and that it's cleared away. There's a whole range of things, but we are going to be looking to provide very clear prevention advice at local borough level to make sure that the local urban-rural interface is being managed in as best way as we possibly can.
Thank you. Stuart, if I just quickly come to you, what improvements would you like to see the government make to support local boroughs with the resilience framework?
I think the key thing is what I've already mentioned, in particular in London, looking to the amount of resource that is given to local authorities in order for us to all be able to respond when an incident happens. We're all sovereign, and we all invest differently in this part of our organisations. And as I've said before, over time, our ability to invest in emergency planning, preparedness and response has been stretched. So some targeted funding, I think, would be helpful to local government, certainly in London.
Do you think there are any further actions the Mayor could take to support local boroughs to prepare for large-scale events of this nature?
I think generally we work very well with the Mayor, the GLA, when there are large-scale events. I mean, I was on the strategic coordination group for the Wennington fire, as well as the partnership calls that Toby mentioned. The communications piece is key, so the GLA played a role alongside local authorities in terms of communicating to our residents, you know, the behavioural piece that has already been mentioned. So generally, I think local authorities and the Mayor, the GLA work well in response to incidents. We also work very closely together. For example, the Queen's funeral, we will on the coronation, planning for that, etc. So there is a lot of work that goes on across London between local authorities and the Mayor's office in both responding but also preparing for the large incidents that, or just large events that take place in London.
Okay, Toby, my final question to you really. How does the LRF routinely capture and disseminate its learnings? Is it a standing item on your agenda? Do you have a mechanism for capturing that learning and disseminating it?
Yes, we do. And the particular question you asked within that, it's a sort of product of all of that learning and implementation, critically, process. Is a standing agenda item for the London Resilience Forum. So there's a lot of work that's led by a couple of people within my team on behalf of the partnership. But it's not something new. It's developed, it's evolved over many years. So I'll explain that. So at the moment, our learning and implementation protocol was reviewed in 2018, and then we've revised our debriefing policy in June 2022, and we're looking to do more work on enhancing the process over the coming year, and that's really about getting into the detail of making sure that lessons aren't just signed off as being complete without being able to really interrogate and demonstrate and see the tangible improvement in arrangements. So the process is that for any major incident or significant incident of note, we like to decide things collectively as the partnership. So again, a tripartite decision about the learning capture process and what's needed. So that will be taken between ourselves and lead agency and other agencies involved. And it really is incident and risk specific as to which agencies sort of get to propose really how that learning and debriefing process will take place, which is then ratified by the rest of the partners. So the incident's happened, and the process starts by asking every agency involved to submit electronic feedback, or at least this is how we've started to do it over recent years. And then our team will collate that and produce a report that sets out all of the pieces of learning, and next to them any recommendations that individual agencies have made about where to improve as a result of that. And then if that's if the incident was there was nothing particularly contentious within that learning, then it might simply be that through a standing learning and implementation group of the LRF, that report gets signed off and agreed by all agencies. Those recommendations go into our database, and then the LRF and the structures under the LRF will monitor those through to implementation. For something more complicated, a debrief session will be held. So if you think of it as I don't know if many of you might have been to one, but sort of probably a 2 or so hour meeting. All of the relevant agencies will be represented around the table, and really they're asking 3 questions of that group: what went well, what didn't go well, and what needs to be done to improve. So that group will debate those areas for a couple of hours, and then again, that's normally put together by our team into a report. From that, we generate our recommendations. Those are approved by the LRF and then monitored by the LRF moving forward. And just a point of detail, so at the moment we have 700 lessons in the database. I know that sounds odd, but it just happens to be an exact figure of 700 as of October 2022. 434 of those are closed, and then all of the rest are being tracked as either in progress or yet to be assigned to a project. And by project, they tend to get aligned to a particular capability working group that sits under the LRF. So if it related to flooding, particularly, then that lesson becomes, seeing that lesson through to implementation is led by the flooding working group that meets under the LRF.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Back to you.
Thank you. And Assemblymember Polanski has one final question.
I've been promised to be very brief. Jonathan, it's about the managing vegetation that you talked about. Is that planned to be out by this summer, and is it something the committee can take a look at?
Short answer to that is yes. So that is something that we're going to be rolling out in the communication to local boroughs in terms of the advice that we're receiving actually from the national structures that exist within the National Fire Chiefs Council. We'll be more than willing to share that information.
And will that include, because when we talk about recovery, that's also nature as well as the built environment. Presumably when there's a wildfire, for instance, it's much more under threat for flooding because the ground is hard. Will that also be encompassed in that work in terms of how to manage a space from all threats?
Absolutely, because the challenge that climate change is giving to all of us as emergency responders, covers the whole gambit in terms of what the weather looks like, whether it's wildfire and extreme heat or whether it's flooding or indeed extreme cold. This is all part of the planning and preparation that we need to do as an emergency service moving forward.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. And thank you to all of our guests for your contributions today. We have a few short items of business before we conclude. You're welcome to stay for that, and you're welcome to leave. It's just a few minutes of additional business. Get out while you can. Not really. You're welcome to stay. Can we note the report and today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from this discussion? Agreed. And can the committee note its work programme? And can we delegate authority to me as chair following consultation with party group members to approve the committee's response to the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities consultation on staircases and sprinklers? Agreed. Great. And the date of the next meeting of this committee will be confirmed at the London Assembly's annual meeting. I have no other urgent business, and I've received no notification of any, so I now declare this meeting to be closed.